In 1931, Walter Prescott Webb published The Great Plains, a book that revolutionized how historians thought about that important subregion of the American West. Webb interpreted the Great Plains through the lens of three dominating environmental characteristics of what it lacked: trees, water, and topography. However, if you navigate around some satellite images of the region, you will find landscapes absolutely riddled with wrinkly rolling hills and shaped by endless waterways. George Frazier's new book, Riverine Dreams: A Way to the Glorious and Forgotten Grassland Rivers of America, invites us along the thousands of miles he has paddled on the region's grassland rivers, highlighting their ecology, history, present conditions, and potential features. Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brendan Rensing. As our conversation this month with Frazier about grassland rivers trains our eyes to see the West's Great Plains and prairies differently, you might head outside and reconsider where you live. There may be something glorious and forgotten in your own backyard as well. Thanks for listening. Writing Westward is a monthly podcast featuring conversations with authors from various disciplines who are writing about the North American West. It is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, am Associate Director and a Professor of History. My goal as host is for these conversations to spark your curiosity about and interest in thinking more deeply about the region's lands, cultures, and peoples in the past and present. This is a one-man operation, with me serving as host, producer, sound engineer, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am trying to make up for that with my passion about the North American West, and I'll take any excuse to read more about it and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. This podcast isn't monetized, so I'm not chasing subscriber stats for gain. But increasing the visibility of the podcast will help promote the works of our excellent guests. So please pause now to subscribe on whatever app you're using, write a review, follow us on Facebook or Blue Sky and leave comments, and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. At the end of the episode, I will include some more information on my own scholarship and the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. And with that, let me introduce who we're talking to this month and why. George Frazier holds a PhD, master's, and bachelor's in computer science from the University of Kansas and is an assistant professor of computer information science at Washburn University in Topeka, Kansas. The credentials behind why we're speaking with him today, however, come from years of exploring the Great Plains and prairies and endless miles paddled along its river systems that connect the region to the Rocky Mountains in the west and the broader American heartland to the east. In 2017, the University of Kansas Press published his first book, The Last Wild Places of Kansas: Journeys into Hidden Landscapes. That book won the Ferguson Kansas History Book Award from the Kansas Authors Club, the Hamlin Garland Prize in Popular History from the Midwestern History Association, a Midwest Book Award from the Midwest Independent Publishers Association, and was named a Kansas Notable Book by the state of Kansas's Center for the Book. In The Last Wild Places of Kansas, Frazier recorded his travels across the state as he explored its impressive ecological diversity, features too often overlooked when people think about Kansas. Our conversation today is on his 2025 University of Chicago Press book, Riverine Dreams: A Way to the Glorious and Forgotten Grassland Rivers of America. This is another travelogue of sorts, but with an expanded geography and a narrowed focus. Ranging from Montana and Colorado in the west to Missouri in the east, Frazier focuses on grassland rivers of America's Central Plains and prairies, a handful of which he chose to paddle by canoe, exploring and writing of his experiences with the diverse landscapes these rivers meander through, and the many peoples interacting with them along the way. Pairing his contemporary observations with historical background contexts, Frazier transforms how we might think of the region. When considering the Great Plains as an ecological subregion of the American West, its rivers may not be the primary feature that most envision. But as Frazier paddles us through miles of their meandering paths, he demonstrates just how central they are to the region's environments and human societies. He explores challenges to their current health and highlights exciting developments that are pointing towards their renewal, a grassland river revival, as he calls it. Westerners everywhere might consider this book a training ground of sorts to help them view their own regional environmental features with fresh eyes. What forgotten natural wonders are we all living among? George Frazier, welcome to Writing Westward.
Hey, thanks for having me, Brendan.
I'm really excited to talk about your book, to kind of revisit where I lived for almost a decade, and reading the book was really fun. There's all kinds of place names and things I remembered from my time in Nebraska, and that was a lot of fun. So to dive in, I wanted to ask, what's your personal kind of history with the West as a region? This is a Western Studies podcast, so give us your background with the West.
Yeah, I live in a transitional state to the west, right? Kansas. So Kansas is, from a geographical point of view, is considered sort of, bicoastal in the sense, in the most non-coastal state. We're split, traditionally the 99th or the 100th meridian, right, is where the West begins historically. And so Kansas is a Great Plains state. It's also a prairie state. And when I was in graduate school at the University of Kansas, I used to spend a lot of time out in the West in Colorado, and I still do to some extent. Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, going on hiking trips. I rode my bike down the coast to the West Coast one summer from Seattle down to San Francisco. And so, at the time, I was in love with the American West, and I would come back to Kansas and the other thing I was in love with was quote unquote wilderness, right? And so the West started me thinking about, you know, we seem to have some sort of a notion of wild places and wilderness in the West, but how does that sort of map into other parts of the country as we start to creep east of that Western divide? And so that's kind of my relationship with the West.
So, I mean, when most people think wilderness, especially if they think wilderness in the West, right, they think craggy mountains or these, desert landscapes, things like that. So, did you find yourself going back to Kansas and thinking, well, what are the quote unquote wild places I can find here?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I think that we're influenced by the Wilderness Act of what is it, 1964, that defines wilderness as a place where man will not remain, right? Where you visit but don't remain. And in practicality, it was in implementing that act, it was a lot easier to reserve, craggy ice sort of strewn mountaintops. But and also think of it as a non-peopled place. There's a lot of discussion about this today, right? But wilderness, that was a misnomer, right? Wilderness has always been a peopled place since people came to North America 12, 16, 18,000 years ago, right? There's discussion about when that happened too. And so, yeah, I mean, it sort of threw me for a loop when I got deeply into this concept of wild ecosystems. What about a place like Kansas, about eastern Kansas? And so, I think a lot of people, Brendan, are thinking about this because there is a demographic shift in America where a lot of people are moving to the Midwest who've lived in these places with more wilderness. And so maybe they want to build their own personal, they want to learn about the land, build a personal wildlands ethos, if you want to use a heady term like that. And in a place like Kansas, they step out the door and the first thing they run into is a barbed wire fence, proverbially, because unlike a lot of Western states, Kansas, and I'm using Kansas as sort of an example, but this is true in the Midwest and the swath of Great Plains states in the eastern parts, is about 98% private property. And so it's a conundrum. If you want to learn about the bioregions or the wild places where you live, how do you even access them to try to decide if they're wilderness or not, right? And so I wrote another book before Riverine Dreams, The Last Wild Places of Kansas. And I picked Kansas because it was a perfect place to take up that question. Now, my second book, Riverine Dreams, is a continuation of that same question. And basically, this was an unsatisfied itch that I have, and I realized that one way to explore prairies in states with not a lot of public land is on rivers.
Yeah, you say that that was your gateway to some of these wild places, the rivers.
That's right.
It's interesting. I mean, you bring this idea of people like moving to the region and maybe moving from places where there were more traditionally identifiable, like wilderness places or even just kind of outdoor spaces to recreate, to do things. And I mean, that was my experience. I grew up in Northwest Washington, did an undergrad here in Utah, and then I moved to Nebraska for almost a decade. And I was in the throes of, grad school and all that, so maybe I wouldn't have had much time to play in the outdoors anyway. But I didn't have, even if with the free time I had, I never did explore outdoor spaces much because I didn't have a gateway. It wasn't legible on the landscape for me to like, where would I go hike? I couldn't just do it like I did back home, where there was all these public lands and you know trail systems really well developed. Although there were some trails and stuff in Nebraska, but um, it's interesting then that for you then rivers was the gateway that then allowed you to find and explore wild places that on landscapes that people would maybe assume that there are not wild places.
Right. And I think rivers are one gateway, and this book focuses on that idea, right? How do we think about prairies um, as wild places? And one way is to think about their relationship to rivers, right? But it goes. I think it also goes beyond just, and it's like you said, a gateway. The first thing we think about is how do we go out and walk around, right? How do we go out and listen to birds? Whatever we're interested in, the reason we want to go out. Maybe we want to go fishing. Maybe we just want to run in a peaceful place in the woods. But then I think it opens doors to all sorts of things. How does this relate to the current status of wild ecos or pseudo wild ecosystems in these places? How does rewilding fit into it? And how does our sort of, I think in the Midwest is a perfect place to think about just the realism of rewilding. There's so much discussion of that going on, and we have this sort of historical a bit to try to establish a baseline of what a quote unquote good place is in terms of wilderness, the dial of wilderness. And I think probably maybe there's even an arbitrariness for how that was picked. Maybe at the time of Euro or American settlement, maybe the time when people first arrived in North America. But we get to really address all of those issues in the wildlands in the Midwest. And so that's definitely a theme that I'm super interested just in my own life, and how do I fit into that landscape as a person who loves wild places and who sort of, as Aldo Leopold said, who needs wild places to sort of feel like I'm at peace in the world.
But in a place like the Great Plains, where so much is private land, other than the rivers, which you can paddle down even if they're crossing private land, you may not be able to be allowed to get out of the river and walk along the shores, right? But other than roads, are there other physical spaces through which people could go out and ask some of these questions about rewilding, going out and experiencing these places, hearing the bird song, other than some designated, there's prairie reserves and there are some public lands, but on the broader landscape, is rivers kind of the only highway through which to go out and explore?
No, and I wanted to in Riverine Dreams, I wanted to focus on rivers because I believe that grassland rivers have been strangely left out of the conversation of American rivers. But to address your question specifically, we have a different sort of um, approach to accessing land, perhaps in the Midwest. Like just because land is private doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and just because land is private doesn't mean there are not fantastic stewards of that land. So in Kansas, in the Flint Hills, where we have the last large remaining swaths of tallgrass prairie left in the world, North American tallgrass prairie type, the landowners of the Flint Hills are the greatest stewards of that land, you know, forever. That's one of the reasons it's still there. And so there are different issues in Midwestern sort of uh, private versus public lands. They feel a little bit different here than in the West. So lots of times you have, you might not be able to access that land all the time and just camp on it willy-nilly, right? But lots of times, many, many times, private prairies, private river bottoms are opened up for the public through various events multiple times per year. I've gone to, places in Kansas that are on private property through relationships I cultivated, but also through just events open to the public so that I feel sort of that I'm part of that space. And in the sense that we're all kind of borrowing land anyways, right? That's perhaps enough, right? And so, so you have to be more creative. You have to expand sort of your expectations. And people in the Midwest, people who've lived here a long time, they kind of know how that goes. So
What's the difference for our listeners kind of more broadly in the American West between a grassland river and the Colorado or the river, these glacial rivers in the Pacific Northwest, where I grew up, or other rivers that people might be familiar with? That how do grassland rivers function differently on a landscape?
So yeah, some characteristics of grassland rivers are, for one thing, these rivers have lower gradients than the rivers that you find in the mountains. And so they flow through broad floodplains that are laced with wetlands and oxbows. And these support, for example, migratory bird corridors that stretch for thousands of miles and are home to singular species like the whooping crane. They're also prone to very pulse-like regimes of rainfall. Okay, so some were historically fed by snowmelt that started in the Rockies and pulse out onto the arid plains. Some are fed by an annual monsoon that you see like in northeastern New Mexico, southern Colorado. And all of them, to more or less, are fed by the thunderstorms that march across Tornado Alley in the spring. And so because of this sort of boom and bust access to a hydrological cycle, these rivers tend to dry up, especially the smaller rivers the farther west you go. And they also have a relative lack of shade because these are prairie rivers. Most of them don't have as many trees as you might find in a forested river in the mountains. And because of that, the water in the rivers typically are warmer than you might find in a river either in the west or the east. And so the fish and the animals that inhabit the rivers have to be incredibly tough and well adapted to be able to deal with these changes. So, for example, if you take a salmon and you drop it in the Riverine River, it's going to die almost immediately, right? It's the fish that have evolved in these, harsher conditions that do well and characterize the rivers. Um, but of course, now, the flip side of this coin is, these rivers have been insulted, right? And so there have been a lot of changes to grassland rivers. So there have been hydrological changes with the conversion to agriculture, right? So water runs off much faster. You'll see that more in a Midwestern river than, say, a wild Western river where you might not plow right up to the edges. There's been a lot of channelization of these rivers because it's great farm country in the Midwest. And, people wanted to plow right up to they want as much. There's multiple reasons to channelize a river, but the idea was to maximize acreage, right? Crop acreage. And so we straighten these rivers, which leads to erosion, all sorts of ecological problems. We lose the prairie buffers. We lose the cottonwood buffers of these rivers. And of course, there's pollution from fertilizer and pesticides. Um, and one thing the grassland rivers share in common with Western rivers is, groundwater mining of aquifers have reduced surface flows. It's sort of a Western twist that links the prairies of the rivers to the rivers of the West.
Yeah, I remember in Nebraska, there was lots of talk about the Ogallala Aquifer, and especially on the southern reaches of it, places where, the water table had dropped just
Yeah.
so far that there were some counties that were saying zero draw, like we can't draw anything out of the aquifer anymore. But that leads to
Yeah.
less surface water in the rivers and all kinds of other systems as well.
I don't know if you talked to Lucas Basire, who wrote the fascinating book Running Out, but that's a great study of the aquifers in the heart of the grasslands that was affected most strongly by the Dust Bowl, right?
Yeah. So I mean, so these rivers have changed quite a bit as well, but you touch on this in various places throughout the book and how the broader grass, long mixed short grass prairie systems of the plains that greeted those first Europeans are very different ecologically than what we see today. What are some of the broader ecological differences of how do these ecosystems function differently today with so much agriculture compared to how they would have before Europeans showed up?
They function in a very different way, right? Because of several reasons. So in the tallgrass prairie regions, most of those prairies have been plowed and converted to agriculture, right? And but it's sort of on a continuum. And so in the tallgrass prairie regions, that doesn't mean agriculture continued forever. It means that they were plowed. And you can think of plowing a prairie kind of like cutting down an old growth forest, right? there's going to, if you think of the prairie, it's the model of the prairie that emerged after the last ice age as, ground zero. Getting back to that is, if it's not impossible, it will take long time frames, right? We humans, we have trouble thinking more than a few generations usually, right? So when a lot, prairie rewilding is something going on in the Midwest, and there's a notion that we don't know how to rewild tallgrass prairies. What we definitely don't know how to do them is rewild them in like 10 years, right? It may take just a few hundred years to bring back a functioning tallgrass prairie. We do know how to rewild tallgrass prairies, and this is recent news, in ways that make them more functionally equivalent to a never plowed prairie, say, like the work going on in Nebraska to take extant tallgrass prairie and then surround it by buffers of sort of rewilded prairie, using large seed bases of 60 to 80 or maybe even like 200 species of grasses. Now, it may not look exactly equivalent. It may not pass. If you're familiar with the Turing test, right, to determine if an artificial intelligence is actually the same as a human in terms of intelligence, it may not pass that prairie Turing test where a wildlife biologist will walk through the prairie and say, "Oh, that's an unplowed prairie," but it may function in terms of, it may support grassland birds, insect species that only live in the tallgrass prairie may move into that. They may work through their life cycles. They're carbon sinks, right? They're creating wildlife corridors of a prairie style, and you know, and then if you pair that with the rewilding of grassland rivers, that seems to me to be low-hanging fruit in terms of a wilder vision of the Midwest. In the sense that, the revival of grassland rivers may be one of the most realistic environmental victories available to us in the Midwest. And so that's why I came to start thinking about, rewilding and protecting prairies as sort of part and parcel with protecting those rivers.
You state that these rivers have been forgotten. So let's shift a little bit and talk more about kind of like public perception, public, discourse, and how people think about the region. In what ways do you think these grassland rivers have been forgotten over the past decades, compared to, rivers in other places?
I mean, it seems to be, yeah, I think maybe the biggest challenge that grassland rivers face is sort of a cultural invisibility. And I didn't come to this by any kind of, philosophy or anything. It was more of a just observation. And so for example, when I started working on this book, I couldn't find a single book, that was outside of the academic space, that sort of that took up grassland rivers as a topic. There are books on single rivers, but just sort of looked at grassland rivers. So they've dropped from the cultural radar, just like prairies have. And I don't, in the Midwest, they like to talk about flyover country. And I think that's sort of a chip on the shoulder of a lot of people in the Midwest. So I'm from the Midwest. I can say that without any, with legitimacy. And so, but perhaps it's in part because of private property, right? And but one thing I write about in the book, I see this more as an opportunity, and I do believe we're at the beginning of a grassland river revival, a renewed awakening of the greatness of these rivers, and there are hundreds of thousands of miles of grassland rivers that go by tens of thousands of names historically through time. So there's a rich collection of these rivers, and in any given year, there are tens of thousands of miles of grassland rivers that nobody really paddles on. Nobody, and not that paddling is the end all of river access for humans, but it's certainly something we've done historically for many years, many centuries, millennia, and certain people like to do today. It's definitely a growing thing. More people are paddling rivers all over the country than in many years. And so for whatever reason, whatever the causes for this it seems to be partially beginning to reverse itself.
Towards the end of our discussion, I want to get to some of these new developments that you talk about this kind of revival, which is exciting. But part of that is simply getting people out there. and making people aware of these places. So this is a huge geography that you're covering, lots of different ecosystems, although you're tying them all together, with this species of a grassland river. But there's different kinds of prairie topography, soils, different kinds of human development surrounding these rivers. So if someone wanted to go out and paddle a quote unquote grassland river, what they're going to encounter is going to vary wildly
That's
depending on where kind of in the American Great Plains prairie states where they paddle. So I thought maybe we could pull out a few examples of not necessarily the extreme contrast, but just some that are just that they look and function and the experience on them is very different. And the three that kind of jumped out to me of the ones you cover were the Purgatoire in Colorado, the Niobrara in northern Nebraska, and then maybe the Kaw or the Grand farther east. What would you say is like the fundamental difference, say, if you spend a day paddling the Purgatoire versus the Niobrara versus the Kaw? Maybe perhaps first, like visually, what is going to strike people between those three?
So and you picked three great rivers. Okay. So I will tell you what, boots on the ground in Colorado, they pronounce it the purgatory.
Yeah, yeah.
So Brendan, I'll refer to it like that. And it's spelled the reason that, and when I started going out there, I tried to say the French pronunciation, and the people, they say, don't worry about it. It doesn't matter if you took high school French, because we call it the purgatory.
And then you have the picket wire, which is like, a
Right.
further devolution of that, right?
The Purgatory is a fascinating river. It's in extreme southwest Colorado. It's a Colorado river, right? But it's definitely unlike anything you think when you think of the term Colorado. So it starts in the Sangre de Cristo Range, and it flows through the canyon lands, which are more like New Mexico of southeastern Colorado, before emerging on the Great Plains in one of the most fabulous remaining prairie sort of strongholds of short grass, arid prairie, Picket Wire Canyon, which is the anglicized alliteration of the term. When English speaking people showed up, they didn't even try. They just turned purgatoire into picket wire, which means nothing, but the word stuck. And this is a very desolate, we would use the term desolate landscape. There's no real archaeological evidence that there are permanent settlements along this river ever, pretty much. And you can take, for example, I like to think of the Larry McMurtry book, Lonesome Dove. There's a character in there, Blue Duck, and he is like the bad guy of the book. And he lived in the Llano Estacado, which is the staked plains of Texas and New Mexico, which was where all this sort of outlaw bad guys were. And at a certain point in the book, they lose track of Blue Duck. They're trying to find him to catch him for his crimes, right? And they say that he has escaped probably to the only more remote wild place in the whole Llano Estacado, and that's the Purgatory. And so the Purgatory has fascinating cultural and biological history. It's the site of a great tarantula migration that occurs in September. But to answer your question, what is it like to paddle the Purgatory? You're going to have to ask somebody else. And the reason is that very few people paddle that river. This is a river that's very, like a lot of, and to your question, how do we experience different types of rivers and different ecosystems? In the most arid spots of the western high plains, they're really not, you don't normally paddle those rivers because they are usually too shallow, right? And so there's not a real paddling culture there, but the Purgatory flows through large swaths of public land. And it was a crossroads for millennia. And so there are ancient trails along that river some of them have been converted into modern trails. And so there's a strong hiking culture along the Purgatory that definitely involves the river as its central piece. So what a lot of people, and I'll encourage people to do this, if you go to the Purgatory, people go there to see the largest dinosaur track site in North America. And the river has eroded this ancient lake bed where you can see these gigantic footprints of brontosaurus walking side by side. And it's an amazing combination of things. So you can see this tremendous dinosaur site in the bone silent Pickawire Canyon flowing right alongside this river. that's populated by probably the most intact fishery in the entire Great Plains. And that is probably because the Purgatory is a very rugged place. And so, just like I mentioned the salmon earlier in the interview, almost no non-native species can survive there. And so when they sample the river, the individual fish are always over 99% native species. So it's a very intact fishery. So this is as close to, there are no pristine grassland rivers, so to speak, in terms of like some maybe ill-thought notion of ancient perfection of ecosystems, but it is a very well-functioning ecosystem in the sense of there's a Colorado geologist, and she's probably the foremost river expert that I've ever met or know of, Ellen Wool. And she
Oh,
has,
I had her on the podcast
that's great.
a couple years ago. She's great.
That's great. And so she has this term. I like to think of what makes a river wild. Okay. So I was looking for relatively wild segments of rivers to include in my book. And there's a lot of meanings of this term. So besides just wilderness, we've got the concept of wild river. Does it mean dynamism? Because rivers are dynamic, right? They wash roads out. They have immense floods. You might not want to build your house next to the Missouri River because every 40 years it's going to flood for miles out in the floodplain. There are wild times on rivers. So you mentioned the Niobrara. There's an ecotourism industry there. And especially if we get out of the Great Plains, that's definitely what's one thing people think about the term wild times on rivers. We could use the term wild from the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, right? And in that sense, they say that the wild rivers that are part of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act are vestiges of wild America. It's vestiges of kind of the lost wildness of America. I don't even really know what that means. But Ellen Wool's definition really rings true to me. And she says that she has the concept of a connected river. And so in a connected river, the riverbank is connected at about the same level of the river. So the river doesn't incise down. So it's very much follows in form and function where a river has its meanders in place, right? It has its riparian buffer. It's connected to its floodplain. When it floods, the waters wash directly into the floodplain and the river is allowed to meander through its floodplain. So to me, a connected river is a wild river. In Purgatory, the Upper Missouri and the Upper Missouri Breaks, the Niobrara, they are definitely sort of connected rivers. And so when you're on those rivers, you sort of, or if you're hiking along the Purgatory, you feel that sense of sort of a wholeness of landscape. And it's interesting to sort of contrast that as you move east into places where there are less connected sections of rivers. What you can start to identify, especially if you've been to connected wild rivers, is that maybe a river like the Kaw has the Kaw in eastern Kansas, which is also a river where people have really rediscovered that river. People are coming from all over the country to try the through float, the 173 miles of the river. It's a perfect length. You can paddle the whole thing in a week. There's a takeout point about every 4 hours with a little town with a brewery. And so it's a really fun river to paddle. It moves along at about 3 miles per hour. And the Kaw probably has the most underappreciated camping resources in the entire American backcountry, which are these sandbars where anybody can camp. You can build, there's plenty of driftwood. You can build fires that you can see from the moon. But the Kaw will flow through sections that, have been not so much straightened, but are more polluted than others. Now the Kaw is as clean as it's been in 100 years, but then you'll take a curve and go through a connected section of the river. And so it's interesting just to in our home river, say if you have a river close to home, I bet, and I would put it as a challenge to anybody to learn that river, find which sections are more connected, which sections aren't, and why that is. And maybe that it sort of is a clue to what we could do to just incrementally improve these rivers over time.
Talk to us about the uniqueness up on the Niobrara of some of the surrounding biota. I mean, you talked about hybrid aspens, which I was not aware of. Lots of talk of very unique penstemons. I mean, the broader Sandhills region is a fascinating ecological region. So what might people experience there that would be unique?
So yeah, the Niobrara River is one of the constellation of Nebraska rivers. There is no more riverine state than Nebraska in the plains, and I would say in the whole country. And so Nebraska has the largest sand dune formation in North America called the Sand Hills. And so this was formed by sand blowing off the Rocky Mountains as they eroded down and forming these really big dunescapes. And so after Euro-American settlement, as fires sort of stopped being as perennial as they were when Native Americans, set them, um, the fires and prairies go hand in hand. And while there are sort of naturally caused fires, the Native Americans in Euro-American settlement times used fire as a tool. Used fire as a landscaping tool that for various reasons, for hunting, for gardening, and one of the side effects was that, or one of the intentional effects was it kept the prairie very healthy, right? It discouraged woody species from growing. So you see back in the eastern states, you see without fire, you see woody species encroaching. In north central Montana or northwestern Montana, what you see without fire is prairies encroaching. And so the sandhills used to be there used to be more raw dunes in the sandhills. So you'd see more raw sand. Today they become and I don't know that I've read about this directly. This is something that I found interesting in researching the book, is that basically really high quality prairies in a short period of time emerged on these dunes with huge biodiversity in like an 80-year period. It could be a model for rewilding. Um, and so one of the things these dunes do is they hold groundwater. And so the High Plains Aquifer intersects with the dunes. And so the High Plains Aquifer in the Sandhills is in pretty good shape, relatively. And so there are lots of rivers we could talk about there, but the Niobrara particularly, it is a wild and scenic river. The National Park System has a section that it manages. And some groups call it the biological crossroads of the Great Plains. And this is because the ecotones of certain species meet there. And so you have many different avian species where the western and eastern sort of quote unquote versions of each other, they come together. And so you have hybridization of those species. Perhaps the most fascinating thing about the Niobrara, from, as you mentioned, the biota sense of the term, is that because of the positioning of the sandhills and the way that the Niobrara cuts down on those sandhills, there are tons of springs that flow into the river, springs and waterfalls on the south side especially. And so they've created these spring runs between a few hundred feet to a mile, where the spring runs down in elevation through a small canyon into the river, and it creates an air conditioning effect. And so when the glaciers of the last ice age retreated, this air conditioning effect remained in place. And there are species of boreal forest tree. You mentioned hybridized aspen, so the species that were, that are typical of the taiga in central Canada and up to the North Pole, they remained in this one small sliver on the south side of the Niobrara. So you can go to the Purgatory and see the footsteps of dinosaurs. You can go to the Niobrara and see the forest of the Ice Age. And just beyond that forest, a vast tallgrass prairie, a sandhills prairie, not tallgrass prairie, a sandhills prairie emerges, and it intersects with it. It covers these dunes, right? So where there are naked scars in the dunes, we have the last remaining examples of the rarest plant of the Great Plains, called the blowout penstemon. And so this is a species that it requires sand to survive. And so you could think of it as like a big bang for prairies. If you have just a raw sweep of sand, blowout penstemon will emerge, like a seed gets dropped by a bird's foot or something. It'll grow, start to send out, its sort of underground system. I'm not a botanist, but it will start to spread out roots and whatnot. And then other species that coexist with it will start to grow. And eventually a prairie emerges and the blowout penstemon dies off. So this is a ecological succession from sand to prairie, right? And there's so little rainfall, trees don't play as big of a role in the arid parts of this ecosystem. And so because of the conversion to prairie of the sandhills, though, biologists thought that blow-up pinstem was extinct in the mid-20th century. And then in the 60s and 70s, they found a few examples of remaining blow-up pinstem in the sandhills, and one colonization in Wyoming. And so the race was on. This is the black-footed ferret of prairie plants, right? The race was on to restore the species, and the race is still going on. It's still a very rare plant, but you can go to the sandhills in the Valentine, Nebraska area, and there are some few sites where they're not really advertised because this is a very rare endangered species, right? But there are tours that people can take in various sites to go see this sort of this what we thought was a lost plant, right? And so if you like endangered species, just for the sake of the coolness that they still exist on the planet Earth, the blow-up pinstem is a fascinating story, in my opinion.
Something we haven't touched on much is you talk a lot about the people you encountered on the water and in nearby communities. And I think at the end we'll get to some of the river advocacy groups that are going on. But amongst, quote unquote, normal Great Plainsy Prairies residents, what did you see it being their relationship with these grassland rivers that flow through their communities? How do they think about them? How do they interact with them? For those who are not engaged in advocacy, ecology work, and things like that.
Right. I mean, I think, as just so you know, I mean, northern and normal, as you say, Great Plains sort of communities, they're not unlike communities throughout the Midwest, right? So you have a combination of people that don't even know there's a river in town, right? And people that might live along the river, or their grandparents have land along the river. So I found just the normal sort of um, uh, continuum of people that were interested in the rivers versus they had no awareness of the rivers, right? But but people that and so I'm going to exclude as because you asked these sort of environmentally interested people that are really, really involved in trying to work with rivers and animals along rivers. There is more of an awareness as you get closer to a river, a main river of those rivers, for sure, right? Because they provide ecological services to people, right? And so when the rivers start to run dry, that becomes a problem. And so there's a heightened awareness of rivers in the western part of the Great Plains from just a resources point of view. And so, a lot of people are really plugged in and deeply aware of how the inputs and land management processes affect, river levels as you intersect the Ogallala Aquifer, for example. So some counties in western Kansas have even sort of made an agreement within a watershed, a water district, say, right, to sort of get together and voluntarily team up to ration water and come up with just sort of ad hoc ways to, like, you get the water from this amount of time or whatever. They work together, right? And so we see water tables rising there. Those people are highly attuned to rivers and water tables. One way you can sort of check the pulse of an aquifer is how much does the river run, right? Um, and then as you move farther to the east, you have higher populations, right? And so again, you see this real diversity of people that don't, they drive across the river going to work every day. They don't even know it's a river. But like I said, there were people, once you got closer to the river, people with land close to the river, people working in agricultural jobs, fields. They're very highly aware of the river, and they know that their livelihoods depends on some level of of taking care of this resource. And so you have so one of the things that seems to bring in our divided age of red versus blue, I found that grassland rivers is something that people can agree and sort of come together on, as Missouri is the perfect state to think about this. So people in Missouri have voted perennially for years and decades to support to support with their tax dollars programs that preserve rivers, that preserve wetlands, right? For an array of activities. So you have groups like Ducks Unlimited and people that are interested in hunting. This is a heritage. Missouri feels like the protection, most Missourians of their of the ecosystems, grasslands, and forests included, right? And the wetlands is part of the heritage of the state. And so you have a project like the Big Muddy National Wildlife Refuge, which is a brand new, in the sense, the glacial sense of new, right? 20 years ago, it was started after the great flood of 1993 on the Missouri, which was a catastrophic flood. An opportunity arose to help out farmers that were just done living in the floodplain, right? And so some funds were set aside at the federal level to start buying up land in the floodplain, willing sellers that just wanted to get out of the floodplain. They didn't want it to once again have these gigantic floods. And so they have been piecing together a national wildlife refuge in the channel of the mighty Missouri River, the lower Missouri, right, which is definitely more affected ecologically than any other big river in the grasslands, the lower Missouri from Kansas City to St. Louis. And they're piecing this together like a string of pearls. And so there's something like 25 units now. And so the ecologists that help work on this, right, have some leeway with how to play with the river channels there, right? And so there's some efforts within some of these units of the Big Muddy National Wildlife Refuge to help the river sort of become more of a connected river in the Ellen Wool sense. And part of these are efforts to revive endangered species like the pallid sturgeon. But these programs have not faced pushback like similar rewilding efforts farther in the West in states like Montana. And so to me, that was an unexpected, fascinating find as I, went about researching the book.
Yeah, I mean, you seem to identify a lot of like what's the missing factor, what's the key to getting people to engage or to not oppose some of these things, and it seems that a lot of it is just awareness, or people building personal relationships with the river. One interesting example you bring up is, in suburban Denver with the South Platte, where they built Shoemaker Park, this kind of collection of trails and some little paddleable whitewater and some stuff, but in the middle of the city with this idea, like if you build it, they will come. Like if we build the kind of recreation infrastructure, people will interact with the river, and then people will be invested in the river.
Yeah, I think the South Platte's probably the greatest example of a city that's re-embraced a river that was once lost, right? That was once almost literally buried. And so there was a large flood on the South Platte, a devastating flood in the 60s that led to the creation of this Chatfield Reservoir. And so below the reservoir, the South Platte had been polluted, terribly polluted for decades. And so some money is partially this is financial. So some money with that project emerged that people started to use to clean the river up. And this sort of started a domino effect. So in Colorado, you already have sort of a population of people that are into outdoor recreation, right? They're climbing mountains. They're focused on mountains and riding bikes and whatnot, but maybe not. But one thing to know about Denver is even though, you think of the Wild West and whatnot with Denver, the modern reality of Denver is different. It's really now the new capital of the Front Range, which is, I think, a new persona that's emerged in the late 20th century. And Denver is a Great Plains city. It's not a mountain city.
It's not a mountain city. No.
It's in the Great Plains. It's got the largest urban population of prairie dogs in the world, right? And so, yeah, after this creation of this reservoir, many efforts were put together to start to build access to the river. So the city had walled the river off, essentially in the early 20th century. It was very urban, industrial, and polluted. And now going on 30 years, there, as you mentioned, there are biking corridors, there are river parks, there are little runs of whitewater. There are places where they've created channels within a channel. And so they're not going to tear down the flood control structures, right, that keep the city from being flooded. But within those structures, and so in that sense, it's not a connected Ellen Wool River, right? It's not the floodplain is high dollar real estate, right? For example, Scott Latona, who manages a park in Littleton, Colorado, they've tried to create a floodplain, a meandering channel within the confines of the raised the levees, so to speak.
Yeah.
And when the river reaches a certain level, it meanders there. And so it's a step in the right direction in that sense. The South Platte is unfortunately still a pretty polluted river because it's just difficult to bounce back in a short amount of time from the level of pollution it saw, late 1800s especially. There's not only urban pollution, but there's mountain pollution coming into that river from mines, there's all sorts of toxins that arsenic and cadmium and those kinds of things that come down from the mines. And so, again, if we allow ourselves to look at bigger time frames, though, than our lifetimes, then there's great hope, I think, for the South Platte. That's why I looked at it instead of a river like the Platte River. I mean, it definitely personifies a lot of these Western River issues, but also it's a hopeful thing because it's really been embraced as part of the urban core of Denver. If you go, you had mentioned that park, Confluence Park. Probably a lot of people have gone there, but the next time you go to Denver, right now at least, the big REI store in downtown Denver is where you would go to. And you go to the big REI center, and it's right there on this beautiful river park. And there's always people kind of surfing on even like surfboards in the river, and families having dinner, and people fishing for trout now. And so it's pretty cool.
I lived in Kearney, Nebraska for 2 years teaching there, and right when we were about to leave, they started what they called like the Kearney River Trail, and it was like a kayaking route along the Kearney Canal, but then dumped into the Platte River. Then you paddle the Platte for a little ways, and there was like a public takeout place. And this was 13, 14, 15 years ago, and it makes me kind of want to contact some people there to see, now that has been a thing for a decade or so, like, has it changed people's awareness about their surrounding rivers or not? I don't know. But I'm encouraged by these kinds of things, and sometimes it's very low stakes. I don't think that cost the county or the city very much money to do at all. It's just building a few access points, doing a little publicity, and over time, it might really change the culture.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's just making people. The rivers are going to sell themselves once people get onto the rivers. That's not a problem. If you go on to the quickest way to access a wild place, an instantaneous switch of mindset is to get onto a river. And so if you can learn to safely paddle, and this is why grassland rivers are perfect. They are slow. They rarely go more than 3 miles an hour. They're very safe as far as rivers go. Rivers are always, you have to always watch yourself on a river. They are never completely safe. You always have to pay attention, right? But they're slow, they're accessible, and many of them are not very deep. You can just use an old cheap canoe on almost every grassland river. You'll be perfectly fine. There's no whitewater. So, if you want whitewater, there are other places to go, but grassland rivers are the gateway to bigger rivers, right? And although I believe they're an end in themselves, but so I'm not worried about once people get on rivers, they love rivers. They learn to want to conserve rivers because they just enjoy the way they feel on rivers. The wildness that I mentioned at the end of the book, a line that sort of struck me as I was starting to spend less time on rivers, that during the research of this book, I lived among wild rivers and prairies, and their wildness lived in me. And there's an exchange of how they influence us, and it's a deep thing. So projects like in Kansas, we've had the Kaw River Trail. It was just a designation. It allowed, people to put up some signs, and then you start to have a little bit more of a demand, and you have groups that form. And so these recreation groups and almost like outfitters, which would have never been in Eastern Kansas before, that start to take people out on the rivers. And so we see a gradual, and in some cases not so gradual, uptick in the usage of the rivers. And it creates a virtuous cycle.
Yeah, because now members of the general public are using the river. They value it in new ways. And so then when there is some ecological issue or environmental issue, or which often becomes a political fight about policy and whatnot, you have members of the general public that are saying, "Hey, wait, no, hold on. I have a relationship with that waterway, and I care about it, and what are you saying that you're going to do or not do?" It
Right.
they become attuned and engaged in ways that they wouldn't have been,
Right, and we had a
otherwise.
recent thing in Kansas in the last month or so, where there in Kansas, we have 3 navigable rivers, and those rivers are public land. You can go anywhere you want on those rivers, on the sandbars, as long as you don't go above the high water mark, and so there are hundreds of miles of this, and there was a bill put into a committee in the Kansas, legislature to allow counties to decide whether they want to prevent access in certain parts of these navigable rivers. And in the one case where they wanted to do this, there were arguments on both sides whether that would be good or bad to solve a problem that a city had in western Kansas. But the unintended consequences are what people were worried about. Could this just open up? We only have the 3 navigable rivers. Kansas is a strange state. The other rivers you have to get permission from landowners to be on. Um, but there was an upswell of support, and not just from the expected people you think would just always write to their Congress people, right? You had all sorts of people writing letters that, hey, we understand this problem. There might be other ways to fix it, but let's not impede long-term access for us for the river, because that's a good thing. Private property is great, and it's also great to have access to these rivers. And so the bill for now died in committee. So I think you're right. And I think just having the Kansas water trail and more people that have got onto that river, uh, uh, you know, helped create this big groundswelling of opinion. I mean, and whether, again, I'm not trying to tell people what to think or which side to be on, but there were a lot more people in favor of maybe thinking longer about how to solve this problem without affecting access to all of our state rivers.
Well, we need to kind of wrap up. I want to pivot to one last kind of question, and you kind of already maybe answered this in a way, but let's assume that we're talking to experienced Western paddlers, people who, their life is on the river. That's their main hobby. The Great Plains probably doesn't come to mind. They're thinking, mountain white water, or like the boundary waters, like wilderness area, up in Minnesota or Big Bend. There's other famous like paddles that are on people's bucket lists. So, assuming that's our audience, these people that have the river paddling bucket list to check off, what's your pitch for why they should come consider a Grasslands River excursion? Like, what would they be pleasantly surprised by, or how would this be a profoundly different experience than what they've had before, so that when they check it off the list, like, wow, that was a real, unique thing to add to my list of things I've done.
Yeah, I mean, for those people, I would have them zero in. So one of the reasons I wrote the book, right, was to point out a whole was to try to take representative rivers that when you think of the union of them, they kind of cover all of the issues that we see in grassland rivers today, and give us a sort of a state of the union of grassland rivers. But one of those spokes of the wheel is people that are really deeply into doing adventure on rivers. I will mention 3 things, right? So 2 of those rivers, the Upper Missouri Breaks and the Niobrara, should be on everyone's bucket list. And the Upper Missouri Breaks, which is in the north central Montana in the Great Plains, is not a whitewater river, right? But it is the Missouri River as it flows through one of the most outstanding sections of the Great Plains. Dan Flores has written that it's perhaps the best place in North America to experience what the plains were once like. And I think I think talking to him is how I first thought to go there. That should be on everyone's bucket list. It's got everything about sort of river adventure that you'd want to have. And the pitch there, and the pitch throughout a lot of these plains rivers is solitude. So you can find, I mean, it's unbelievable to me that Upper Missouri Breaks is such a fantastic river, but if you plan your days right, you can have the river to yourself. And then as you move to less well-known rivers, you can have the river to yourself almost any time, and with a little planning. So that's the Upper Missouri Breaks. The Niobrara, not so much. There's a lot of people on that river. It can be irritating for somebody that has that mindset. I want to be on a wild river, because you have people drinking beer and having a great time, and like, big cattle tanks. And so there's a fun time.
Yeah. I remember hearing about this in grad school about people tanking the river. I'm like, well, they're doing what? They're
That's
taking cattle water tanks, sealing them up so they're like completely watertight, and they float them down the river and get drunk.
That's right. And so they have a great time
Yeah.
on about a 15-mile section of the river. And the rest of the river is a wild, is that section of the river is also a wild river, but it's in the polymorphic
Different
sense.
ways.
And the other pitch I'll make is that we have a culture. Part of Grassland River revival is this emerging trend to do, or at least these organized paddling races on Plains rivers. So the Great Plains rivers are perfect for having organized long distance floats because there's a takeout about every 12 miles. And so if you need that, just opens up a lot of opportunities for organizing long races. So I think the finest long distance river race in the world is the MR 340, which is the Missouri River 340-mile ultra marathon canoe race. It starts in Kansas City. It goes 340 miles across the entire state of Missouri.
And you did it.
And I did it. And I even though I paddled almost 2,000 miles working on this book, I am not. I fall in the middle. This is not a book about a guy that I've never paddled in my life and now I'm going to paddle a trillion miles. It's not that book. I'm a good paddler, but I'm not like an Olympian, right? And, I don't normally paddle 300 miles at once, but it's something that with a little bit of training, and what you really need on that event is grit, because it's uncomfortable. It's not painful and it's not physically challenging. It's just the endurance aspect of it. But it's a heck of a lot easier than doing something like walking the Appalachian Trail. You've got 4 days. You need to paddle almost all day and most of the nights to finish by their cutoff time. But you will see sights that few people have seen who are alive today of such great beauty on that river. And perhaps, Brendan, I'll leave it at that as an opening for people to come to Missouri, paddle the MR 340, or paddle the Kansas River if you want to see what that's like. But it as a warm up, and I think the people of the Midwest would love to have some of those Western paddlers.
That's a good teaser. I like this. Well, as we close, can you tell us a little bit about what it is you're working on next? Do you have new adventures in the works, new books in the planning?
I will definitely still write more books about what it is, this way that we access the meaning of wild places in places that they're not expected. So that's sort of my beat, is how it's not about the Midwest as a region, about regional writing. It's about using the Midwest as a model for how we can think about wild places and how they intersect with our lives. And so you'll find me writing more books about that. I usually give the Riverine Dreams came out in October, and I usually give the book about a year. It takes me a long time to write these books, and I piece out during that time and gather my thoughts. And I'm well along the way in that process, but stay tuned, please.
Oh, great. Well, I mean, you do have a full-time job as a professor that does not involve writing books and paddling rivers. So this is a great moonlighting gig you have going on. Well, congrats on the book. I really loved it. And thanks so much for spending a little time with us today.
Thank you, Brendan. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care, George.
Okay, cool. I appreciate it, man. Have a good day. Thanks.
Thank you again for listening. You can find links to our guests' works in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. This podcast isn't monetized, so I'm not chasing subscriber stats for my own gain. But increasing the visibility of the podcast will help promote the works of our excellent guests. So please pause now to subscribe on whatever app you're using and write a review. Follow us on Facebook or Blue Sky and leave comments. And share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, often live streaming them on our YouTube channel. We have an annual funding cycle with award, grant, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at redcenter, reddcenter.byu.edu. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is linked in the show notes. My name is Brendan Rensink, and I serve as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else for the podcast, so you can direct any praise, or more likely critiques, my way. I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, native peoples, genocide studies, religion, the environment, and more. My recent titles include a 2018 book, Native But Foreign: Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America. A 2019 anthology I co-edited with Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I recently launched a new series with the University of New Mexico Press entitled The West in Context. Send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Red Center, I'm also the general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It is a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written micro-histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more that you can use remotely or on a road trip. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, the Red Center, or anything else, head to bwrensink, that's bwrensink.org, email me at bwrensink@byu.edu, or follow me on Blue Sky at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, be kind.